Masechet Ketubot, Daf Lamed Aleph. We're speaking about the principle of Kimle B'derabamine, that if someone does one action which causes him to be liable to capital punishment and pay money, then we give him only the capital punishment and he is patur, he's exempt from the payment. So that's for sure true if we're talking about capital punishment in the hands of a court. But what if it's something like karet? Well, we saw the opinion of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana that says that applies kimle b'derabamine even if it's something like karet. Okay, now we're going to analyze a statement that we saw yesterday. We're going to analyze it further. Kufa. Amar Rav Chisda moder Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana begonev chelbo shel chavero v'achalo shu chayav shekevan yitchayev b'gneva kodem sheyavo lidei isur chalev. The prohibition of eating chaleb is a prohibition of karet. So if someone would steal and eat karet at the exact same moment, then they would not have to pay for the chaleb they stole because they get karet. But here the chidush is that even Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana would agree that if someone stole chaleb and ate it, he would be liable. The reason is because as soon as he picks it up, he's already liable to stealing. And only a few moments later, when he puts it in his mouth and swallows it, then he's liable to karet. So therefore, the two liabilities do not actually happen simultaneously, but rather two actions are one after the other. All right, that was Rav Chisda's statement. And now we're going to bring a case that's similar, but it comes to a different conclusion. Lema peliga de Rabbi Abin. It would seem that he would disagree, Rav Chisda would disagree with Rabbi Abin. Now, he can disagree. They're both Amoraim, but still we want to know, are these two cases, is there a distinction between these cases, or are they the same case, and therefore these two Amoraim disagree? Damar Rabbi Abin, Hazorek Hayetz Metechilat Arba Amot. לסוף 4 וקרא שיראין בהליכתו פטור שהקירה סורך הנחה היא. If someone on Shabbat shoots an arrow, so the law regarding carrying in the Shut Rabim on Shabbat is, in order to be liable, one has to pick something up, an akira, have it move 4 amot in the public domain, and hanacha, and it has to land as well. So if one picks it up, walks, and puts it down, that would be chayav. Or if someone takes an object and throws it or shoots it, so the shooting it would be the akira, moving for amot, landing, then the person is liable. So therefore, if someone shoots an arrow, now on the way, in the middle, while the arrow is going, it tears into a piece of clothing, a silk piece of clothing that belongs to someone else. So now that is stealing because I damaged their clothing. I have to pay for the damage, and it's also a violation of carrying on Shabbat. But in this case, we say patur. Even though the moment, when am I liable for the arrow? At the moment it lands. I'm not liable until I shoot it, it moves, and it lands. If it would burn up in the middle, then I wouldn't be liable. So therefore, first it tears the cloth, so I'm liable to payment, and only a couple of seconds after, when it lands, then I am liable for Shabbat. And so therefore, both of these, since I'm liable to both, patur. Now you'll tell me, why should be patur? It should be the same as the previous case here, because they don't happen simultaneously. First I have to pay, and only when it lands, then I'm chayav for Shabbat. No, but the reason is that the akira was sorech hanacha. So that's the important principle we're going to see a few times, that the lifting up, or the shooting in this case, is for the purpose of it being set down. In other words, it's a prerequisite. They go together. There's no, and therefore, I'm going to consider it all one act. So the shooting, the moving, and the landing are all one act. It's not that I'm liable only at the end, but throughout this act, that's one long act. And therefore, the cloth gets ripped at the same time as the act of carrying. And therefore, patur, I would only get liable for Shabbat and not liable to pay. Hachenameh behagbaha sorech achilahu. So here's the question. Really, these cases are the same, because you can also say that taking some food and lifting it Why am I lifting it? Because I want to eat it. So it's all part of one long process that I need to lift it in order to put it in my mouth. There's no way I could eat it without lifting it first. So why don't you say that's a prerequisite? And therefore it's all one long act of eating. And if it's all one long act of eating, then the theft, which happens the moment I lift it up, would be simultaneous to this long act of eating that includes lifting it and swallowing it. So it looks like here Rav Chisda and Rabbi Abin disagree, unless we can find a distinction between the two cases and say that they would actually agree. So we do say that there is a distinction. Hachi hashta, these cases are not the same. Hatam I efshar lahanacha belo akira. In the case of the arrow, there's no way for it to land without it being lifted first, right? What goes up must come down. But if it never went up, then it can't come down. And so therefore, it's an absolute prerequisite. I cannot land it unless I lift it. But it is possible to eat something without lifting it. I don't have to lift it into my mouth. I can lower my mouth down to the table and eat it without lifting. And so therefore, the lifting and the swallowing are two different acts. And so therefore, that's why in that case would be chayav. The lifting would be liable to pay, and then the eating would be liable to karet. Inameh. Or another way to conceptualize the difference, hatam, in the case of the arrow, iba'eh, lahadura, lo maseh mehadar la, hacha maseh mehadar la. Once I shoot the arrow, if I want to bring it back, I feel bad after I shot the arrow. So I shouldn't have done that. Control Z. I can't do it. Once you shoot the arrow, there's no way to bring it back. And that's why it's considered all one act, right? One act from shooting to landing is all the same because it's going to happen automatically, inevitably, just like domino effect. And so therefore, even though it takes some duration from the moment that I shoot it, it is the act of carrying, and therefore the act of carrying is simultaneous to the tearing of the cloth. So both liabilities happen at the same time, and therefore I don't have to pay. Whereas in the case of the eating, if I pick it up, I think I'm going to eat it. But then I change my mind. I say, you know what, I'm not going to eat it. I put it down. Right? It's not inevitable just because I picked it up that I have to eat it. It's very easy to change my mind and put it down. So therefore, the actions are separable, and the act of picking it up, that's when I'm liable to stealing. And only when I put it in my mouth and swallow it is a separate time, a separate act. And that's why, in that case, I would be liable because they happen at different times. Okay, good. Ma'ika ben hayli shana l'hayli shana. Now, wondering, what's the difference between these two formulations that we said? One is that they cannot go down unless it goes up first, and therefore they're necessary for each other. It's a prerequisite. And the other, that it cannot be undone once the arrow was sent. Would be there be a case where, depending on which reason you say, you would come to a different conclusion? There is. If I'm carrying a knife in the shut harabim, so I picked it up and now I'm carrying it. And while I'm walking, continuously walking, I cut some silk garment. According to the first explanation, that there's no way to put it down unless I pick it up, so it's a prerequisite. It's all part of the same act. So say this would be the same as the arrow. I pick up the knife, and then I walk, and then I put it down. That's all one long act of carrying, and the theft happens in the middle, and therefore be patur. But according to the other one that says it happens automatically, I can't take it back, that's only true for an arrow. Whereas with the knife, I can pick it up, and then I can say, you know what, I changed my mind, and put it down. And so it's not inevitable that when I pick it up, I'm going to carry it and put it down. I might pick it up and put it down without moving it, and then I would not be liable. And so therefore the acts of picking up and putting down according to that reason, are separable. Because they're separable, it's only the act of putting down that makes me liable to Shabbat, and that happened at a different time than the time of the cutting of the silk, and therefore I'd be liable to both the both penalties. Okay, good. Now, gufa. And now we're going to analyze this statement that this is one gufa leading to another. We mentioned this statement of Rabbi Abin as part of that question, but now we're going to analyze it in and of itself. Amar Rabbi Abin, hazorek chetz metechilat arba lesof arba, kara vekara shira'in balichato patur shekira sorach hanacha. I shoot an arrow 4 amot, and it tears a silk garment on the way. Patur, because the lifting is for the purpose of, is a prerequisite, is for the purpose of putting down, and therefore it's all one act, and so they happen simultaneously. That's what he said. Mativ Rab Bevai bar Abaye. Now we're going to challenge it from a case of Shabbat. Hagonev kis b'Shabbat chayav. Shekevan nitchayev b'gneva kodem sheyavo lideh isur sekila. I go into someone's house and I pick up a purse and I take it outside. So now there's 2 liabilities here. One, I have to pay back because I stole the purse, and second, because I carried it from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim on Shabbat. So in this case, I would be in fact be chayav, even though I violated 2 acts in one. And so you would say, how come I don't only get capital punishment? The reason is because I have to pay for the theft immediately. As soon as I pick it up in the house, I already acquire it, right? There's different ways of acquiring things. Picking up is one of the ways of acquiring it, and that can work even though I'm in the other person's house. Once I put it in my hand, so I acquired it. So I'm liable to pay at that moment before a violation of Shabbat. Kodem shevod sekila. I only get sekila when I cross the threshold, take it outside, and put it down. Okay. Haya megarer veyoseh patur. The Braita continues with, this question is going to be from the first case, but the Braita continues and says, if I don't pick it up inside the house, I'm the thief, and instead I just drag it along the floor, and never pick it up, patur, then I do not have to pay for the purse. Because in that case, dragging something is not a way of acquiring it in someone else's house. We need to know this background here. If I pick something up anywhere, I acquire it, which meaning I would steal it, or if I'm buying something, I would buy it. Okay, but dragging only works in my property. So if it's in my own field, my yard, my house, and I drag something, I acquire it. Or it could work in a public domain if it's in a secluded area. They would have like the main thoroughfare, and on the side would be a kind of service lane where there'd be little pockets that people could gather together and have a little bit of privacy. So if I drag something in one of those private, secluded areas, then also I acquire it. But if I drag something in the middle of the street of the public domain or in someone else's house, I do not acquire it. So in this case, I'm dragging it along, and in that case, I would not have to pay for it because the violation of Shabbat and the violation of stealing it happen at the same time. I don't steal it when I'm in the house because I'm only dragging it. Only when I leave his house and I'm in some semi-private area that doesn't belong to him, that's when I'm liable to stealing, and that's also when I moved from his domain to a public domain, and that's why it would happen at the same time. Okay, that's the Braita. And here's the question. In the Resha, when you said if I actually pick it up in his house and remove it outside, how come you said chayav? Because the liability to payment happens first and only chayav Shabbat after I take it out and put it down. Why don't we say the same principle, that the lifting is for the purpose of taking it out, and it's all one long act, and that should be patur. So the answer is we're talking about a case when at the time that I lifted it, I had in mind, I'm going to lift this because I want to steal it. But I'm not going to take it outside. I'm just going to hide it somewhere else in this person's house. For example, I'll hide it in his garbage can. And that way, when they take out the garbage, then I'll come and I'll steal it later. But right now, I don't have in mind to steal it out of the house. I have in mind to acquire it for myself, thereby stealing, but not take it out of Shabbat. But then, after I have it in my hand, I say, you know what? I don't know when they're going to take out the garbage. I don't know, that's too dangerous. I'm just going to put it in my pot. I'm just going to take it with me and take it outside now. In this case, at the moment that I lifted it up, I am only liable to payment because at that moment I wasn't considering the Shabbat. Only after I take it out and put it down, then there's a violation of Shabbat. So since I didn't have in mind to violate Shabbat when I picked it up, it's not one long act. So maybe we're talking about such a case like that. And we ask, wait, in that case, I would not be liable to Shabbat at all, not even after I take it out and put it down. Because, Rab Simon, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mefaneh Hafasim Mizavit Lezavit, V'nimlach Alehem V'hosian, Patur, Shelo Hayta Akira Misha'a Rishona Lechach. If someone is moving objects around in his house, from this corner to that corner, all within the house, that's totally permitted. But then I pick one up, and after I pick it up, I say, you know what? I want to take this outside. And I take it outside. Patur. There's no liability even after I take it outside and put it down. Because there was at the time that I lifted it up, I did not have in mind to take it out. It wasn't for the purpose of taking out, and therefore it doesn't have all the elements required for a biblical punishable violation of Shabbat. And so that can't be the case, because then I wouldn't be chayav Shabbat at all. And we need a case where where someone is chayav both to pay and also Shabbat. So lo tema al menat lahasni'o ela al menat laha'otzio. Okay, so go back to the original presumption that we're talking about a case where I picked it up not to hide it, but rather to take it outside. And so now back to the question. So then, how come we don't say that that's all part of one long act and I should be not liable to pay? When I stood, meaning I picked it up to steal it, I walked a little and stopped. Stopping, then continue walking again. So that stopping makes a new lifting up. The act of lifting up doesn't have to mean literally picking it up from the floor. If I'm already holding something and start walking, that's also called akira. And so in this case, the first lifting is stealing. When I walk a little and stop, then that ends that action. When I start walking again, that's a new akira, and then I take it outside, and so that's the case we're talking about, that I'm liable to both. Okay, now we ask about that. It only works depending on why I stopped. If I stopped in order to put it back on my shoulder. If someone's carrying a burden, sometimes you have to stop and adjust the burden to make it balanced. Now, that's part of the way of traveling, of walking. That's not considered a stop. I didn't stop because I wanted to wait for someone. But rather, it's part of the carrying. Adjusting is the same as part of the long act of carrying. And therefore, if I'm carrying I'm stealing a big TV from the guy's house, and I need to adjust it a little, so that's still considered one continuous act, and I shouldn't have to pay. Ela be'omed lafush. Rather, must mean I stop to rest. Okay, fine. So that would work. If I stop to rest, then there would be two separate actions, and that's why I would be chayav. Okay, now that does answer the question, but this thing of stopping for because I want to readjust, so you're assuming that then I would be not liable if I stopped to rest totally, because then that makes it two acts. Stealing, then I stop, and then I start walking again, and that's for carrying. If that's true, then I have a question about the Braita's choice of the two cases, the Bresha and the Sefer. Remember, the Braita chose the Resha is where I pick it up and take it out. The Sefer is where I drag it out. Now, usually a Braita, when it's going to contrast two cases, it wants to bring them two cases that are as similar as possible, that are just a little bit different, that makes one chayav and one patur. So if it's true that if I just stop to adjust my shoulders, adjust the weight, then it'll be patur. Then the Braita should have mentioned that case. Adetani haya megarer v'yoseh patur niflog v'nitne bedida b'med v'memorim be'omed lafush aval lechatef patur. You should have talked about the very same, within the same case of picking something up, that if I stop altogether, then when is it true that I would be chayav if I stop to take a rest? But just change one little thing. If I stop to adjust the burden, then patur, and that would have been a better contrast between two more similar cases. So therefore we reject that. Ela hamane ben azayhi. Rather, it must be that this baraita is the opinion of Ben Azai. De'amar mehalech ke'omed dameh. He said walking is like standing. According to Ben Azai, in the laws of Shabbat, if I continuously walk, I would still be liable, even if I don't stop, because he thinks that every step is like a little stand. Every time I put my foot down, even though I'm still in moment, I could freeze that snapshot and say, look, see, his feet are on the ground, so he's standing. And therefore, every step he takes is like another stopping. And therefore, every time he takes a step, this is a new act of akira. So the first time he picked up the purse, so he's stealing it. Then as he's walking, every step he takes is not constantly balancing. Every step he takes is like he's stopping. And therefore, you couldn't possibly say this is only true in a case where he stops in order to rest. But if he's stopping because he's always stopping, even if he doesn't stop to rest, it's as if he's stopping to rest, according to Ben Azai, and therefore you couldn't make that distinction between these two tight little cases. Okay, so that's why I had to talk about dragging on the floor. So now we say, hold on, even according to Ben Azai, aval zorek mai patur niflog v'nitneh bedida. Even Ben Azai would agree that if I take the purse and throw it, then that's all one act. And so it should be patur. So it should mention that distinction. Instead of going to that stranger case of dragging on the floor, say if I pick it up and walk it out, then chayav, because every step is a new act. But if I pick it up and throw it, then patur, because that's one continuous act of carrying, and the picking up is part of the throwing, and so then it would be patur. Why not make the small distinction as follows? When is it true that I'm chayav? Only if I'm walking, but if I throw it, patur. So why not make that distinction? And the answer is, you really could have, but actually the Braita wanted to teach us a chidush about dragging. I might have thought that dragging is not a typical way of carrying things. And there's a halacha throughout all of the laws of Shabbat, you're only liable to capital punishment to biblical punishment if you do something in the normal way that it's usually done. But if you do something in an unusual way with a shinui, then one is not liable. And so therefore, most of the time, if you're going to carry something out, you're going to pick it up and then walk. You're not going to drag it along the floor. But it wants to teach us that even though that's not the most common way of carrying things, but sometimes people do drag things, and so it's considered usual enough that one would be liable. That's what it wanted to teach us. Okay, now, follow up on that. What kind of item are we talking about? What kind of purse? If it's something very big, like a suitcase, well then that's the normal way. You drag it, roll it along the floor, and so then one certainly would be liable for hotza'ah, for that. But if it's very small, then for sure it's not the case. No one would take a wallet and drag it, a little wallet, and drag it on the floor. That certainly would be patur, because nobody does that. But rather it must be something that's in between, and that's the chidush, that's something that is in between, that sometimes you might drag it, but usually you don't, will nevertheless be chayav. Okay. More follow-up on this case. When one takes this purse and he's dragging it from the guy's house to outside, what area is he going to outside? If he takes it out to the public domain, the thoroughfare where there's lots of people walking, well then that certainly would be a violation of Shabbat. But he would not, because from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim, that's the definition of Hotza'ah. But he would not be liable to stealing because he's dragging it. And dragging does not work in Reshut HaYachid, in someone else's property. It also does not work in Reshut HaRabim. Dragging only is an acquisition in my own property or a secluded area of Reshut HaRabim, and this is neither of them. So that can't be the case. If I'm moving it from his Reshut HaYachid to another Reshut HaYachid, so let's say he's my next door neighbor, and so we have our houses or courtyards adjacent, and so now I'm dragging it from his courtyard to my courtyard. In that case, yes, I would be stealing it as soon as it goes into my courtyard. So now I acquire it, so I'm stealing, but I will not violate Shabbat, because moving something from one Reshut HaYachid to another Reshut HaYachid is not a biblical violation of Shabbat. So what case are we talking about? Must be talking about a case where I take it from his house and I move it to the side street of the Reshut HaRabim. On the sides over there is an area that is somewhat secluded where you can have some privacy, and Mishicha, dragging over there, would acquire it. Alright, good. So that seems to be a good answer, but still there are a number of opinions about those side areas of Reshut HaRabim, how we define them. Uchman. Rabbi Eliezer thinks that the side areas of a public domain are the same law as a public domain, no difference between them. Well, then it wouldn't work, because Ishur Shabbat Ika, we do have a problem of violating Shabbat, because we went from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim, but Isur Geneva Leka, but there's no violation of stealing because I only dragged it, and according to him, the side of the Reshut HaRabim, the same as Reshut HaRabim, and dragging doesn't work, so I never acquired it. And if I follow the other rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and they say the sides of the public domain are not like the public domain, then I did steal it because this is a secluded area, and so I acquire it by dragging it. But Isur Shabbat Deka, but no violation of Shabbat, because I'm only violate biblically Shabbat if I go from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim. And this is not Reshut HaRabim, it's something in between, like a Karmelit, so that's only would be Dirabanan. So which one is it? Who are we going to follow? And the answer is, Lo'olam Rabbi Eliezer, V'chi Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Reshut HaRabim, Reshut HaRabim Damu. We're going to follow Rabbi Eliezer. When he said that statement that we treat the sides as if they are the same as Reshut HaRabim, he wasn't saying that they're the same across the board. Rather, only the same for the violation of Shabbat. Because even though usually a lot of people don't go there, sometimes there's so many people, there's so much traffic that there's even a lot of traffic in those side areas. And therefore, it is considered Reshut HaRabim for the purposes of Shabbat. But when it comes to acquiring things, if you pull something there, you do acquire it, because generally people don't go there. And so if you want to do a transaction, it is safe to do that. It's private enough. And so even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that it is acquired in that area, and therefore in that area one could violate both carrying and stealing at the same time. Good. And now we finally have the case of the Sefa of the Braita, where one is patur in dragging something from a purse from someone else's house outside. All right. Now, another answer altogether. Rav Asher Amar Kegon sheseraf yado lemata mishelosha v'kibelo. Another case could be where I'm dragging it. So while I'm dragging it, I didn't acquire it yet while I'm in his house. And then I go to a Reshut HaRabim. And as soon as I pass the threshold to the Reshut HaRabim, so then I'm going to violate, because, it's already down on the floor, so I don't have to put it down. And here's the thing. At the same time, right when I go through the person's doorway or gate at the threshold, I take the purse and I put it into my other hand. I slide it into my other hand while it's still being dragged on the floor. And so therefore, once it's in my hand, for sure I acquire it. Because a person's hand is the same as his domain, a 4x4 amot area. And therefore, even if it's in the middle of the street, once it's in my hand, even if I didn't pick it up, it still is called an acquisition. So if I do that at the very same moment, I would be liable to both Shabbat and stealing at the same time, and that's the case of the sefa, where I would not have to pay because it did happen simultaneously. Good. Some other Amoraim and what they said about this case. Ravacha matne Ravacha said everything as we just said. Rabina matne. Rabina explained this case differently. He says, "Lolam dapeket l'shut rabim u'b'shut rabim name kana." He thinks that where I went from the shut yachid, I took the guy's purse and I dragged it into a public domain. But he thinks that if I drag something in a public domain, that is considered an acquisition. He goes against the assumption we've had so far that I can only acquire something in a private area. Now, these two Amoraim, one saying that one cannot acquire by dragging something shutabim, and one saying one can, their machloket depends on how we interpret the following Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in Masechet Baba Kama. Titanan, Haya moshcho veyoseh, umet birshut be'alim patur. So we have the Resha says, if I go and steal someone's animal and I was dragging it as I was pulling it out, and it died while still in the courtyard of the owner, I don't have to pay for it, for the liability of death, because it's not beyond my control, right? Even thieves have some protection. So I meant to steal it, but it's not my fault it died, so I don't have to pay. But if I pick it up, or if I took it out of his courtyard and it died outside the courtyard, then either by picking it up or by removing it from his domain, then I acquire it already. Once I acquire it, then I am liable to pay him back, because I'm a thief. So even if it dies in my possession. I have to pay it back. Good. That's the Resha and the Sefa. Now, Ravina, who thinks that dragging something in the Shut Rabim is a way of acquiring something, Ravina Dayek Meresha, he's going to learn that from the first case. Ravacha Dayek Mesefa, Ravacha, who says that dragging in Shut Rabim does not acquire, he's going to infer that from the second part of the Mishnah. How so? Ravina Dayek Meresha, Hayamoshcho v'yotzeh, Umet b'shut ba'alim patur. It says that if one was dragging, he goes into someone's courtyard, the thief, and he's dragging the animal out, and it dies while it's in the reshut, meaning the courtyard of the owner. Then he's patur. So we can infer, Tamad demet b'shut ba'alim. The only reason why the thief does not have to pay for the animal that died is because it's still in the owner's possession, because it's still in the owner's property. Therefore, if he removed it and went past the threshold and he dragged this animal into the public domain, then dragging it in public domain, he will acquire it, and therefore if it dies there, he would have to pay for it. So we can conclude that dragging something in Reshut Rabim does acquire. That's what he infers from the Resha. Ravacha dek misefa higbiho o shehotzio hotza dumyad hagbaha. It says there are two cases in the sefa: if he lifted it up or if he dragged it out. So the dragging out must be in a way that's similar to picking up, because it compares them back to back. Just like picking up, I acquire something when I pick it up, no matter where it is. So too, when it says dragged it out, it must mean that I dragged it into my own domain, not into the Shut Rabim. It has to mean that, because it has to be similar to picking up. And therefore, it's only mine when I drag it out into my domain, but not if I drag it out into the Shut Rabim. Okay, good. So that's how they both infer it. Now the problem is, what is each going to do with the other clause of the Mishnah? The Ravacha Kashya Resha. How's Ravacha going to explain the inference that we could make from the Resha? The Ravina Kashya the Sefa. How's Ravina going to explain the inference that one could make from the Sefa? So the answer is Resha the Ravacha la Kashya Kamad la te l'shute l'shut ba'alim karena be. Ravacha is not going to make such an inference from the Resha. He's going to say that as long as it's in the courtyard of the owner and I'm pulling it, then I don't acquire it. That person is liable. And in fact, as long as it does not come to my property, even if it's in Reshut Harabim, it still continues to be called the domain of the owner. So even after I pass the threshold of the owner's gate and into the Reshut Harabim, it's still the ownership of the owner, still the possession of the owner, until I drag it all the way back to my house. And so therefore he will not make the inference from that inference from the Resha. And from the Sefa, Ravina is not going to make an inference. He's not going to say that Hotzah has to be the same as Hagbah. It's true, if I lift something up, no matter where it is, it's mine. But the Hotzah doesn't have to mean dragging into an area that's mine. Rather, it can mean dragging into the Reshut Harabim. And so he would have no problem. He would not make such an inference, and rather he would say that if it left the Reshut Harachid and went into the Reshut Harabim, then he does acquire it even through dragging, according to Ravina. And so that's how each one, even though they're both deriving their laws from the very same Mishnah, one is emphasizing the inference from the Resha, and he says, no, I don't agree with your inference from the Sefa, and the other one is doing the opposite. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen. Amen.